CGTN, China Global Television Network.
President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was sworn in last week as Egypt's head of state until 2022, garnering 97% of total votes cast. Sisi's re-election coincides with instability in the Sinai Peninsula, political tensions at home, and a tough path to the country's economic recovery. So, in his second and final term, what strategies does Sisi have to show up Egypt's future? And with the growing challenge of terror, what more can be expected that will build on gains made by the Northern African state? I am Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. It was a second landslide victory for Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in the race for Egypt's presidency. Now firmly in office, the Egyptian president has his entry full. Egypt's fragile economy posted a 13.3% inflation rate in March, the lowest in 2 years. Security continues to pose a challenge, and the president has vowed to fight those who choose violence, terrorism, and extremist thought. Let's take a look at the state of affairs in Egypt in the aftermath of the recently concluded elections and his early June inauguration.
Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has begun his second term in office on the back of a landslide electoral victory that saw him secure 97% of the vote. The 2018 elections, however, saw a low turnout at just 41% of the total registered voters compared to 47% turnout in the 2014 race. As is customary, among Sisi's immediate and most important tasks now is the constitution of a new and all-inclusive cabinet. This is expected to happen in the next few weeks. However, the cabinet was recently reshuffled in January, and little changes are expected as Cairo gears to tackle significant economic and security challenges over Sisi's next 4-year mandate. In his inauguration speech addressed in front of members of government, Sisi cited security as a top priority for his administration's agenda, and indeed, there's a context to this. Some of the deadliest terror attacks on Egyptian soil occurred during Sisi's first term in office. They include the 2016 downing of a Russian passenger jet from Sharm el-Sheikh, the bombing and gunmen attacks of Coptic churches in Cairo, and the Alexandria car bombing in March of 2018. Sisi has vowed to crush violence, terrorism, and extremism. Sisi also faces the challenge of reinvigorating the Egyptian economy, which has struggled in the last few years. Tourism holds the key to this revival plan, with the industry registering a rebound in 2017. Equally crucial to this blueprint is the Sino-Egyptian relations, which has seen China's investment increasing in the past years. Chinese banks are also providing funding to the construction of New Cairo, Egypt's new capital. With a new lease of life extended for Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's administration, economic performance and security and Egypt's role in Middle Eastern affairs will determine Sisi's legacy in Egypt.
And joining me to analyze the state of affairs in Egypt and President Sisi's second term in office is my expert panel of guests. From Cairo, we have Dr. Ziad Akil, a political analyst and researcher with the Ahram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. In Philadelphia is Michael Jones, a policy analyst, president and executive director of the National Tea Party Community. And here in Nairobi, we have Dr. Mustafa Ali. He is a security and conflict resolution expert. Thank you all for joining us today. And Dr. Akil in Cairo, let's begin with you. Egypt just recently concluded an election in which President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi won by 97%. So looking at the outcome of that election, would you say that Sisi enjoys a popular vote? He's ruling through the popular will?
Well, there are mainly 2 points at this dimension. First of all, that you have to realize that Egypt has been at a phase where it's been sort of very difficult to find political leadership because of so many different dimensions within the different political forces in Egypt and so many fragmentations in the post-revolutionary context. At the same point, there is some sort of a very, very supportive lobby of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, regardless of how you judge his policies. There is a big supportive lobby for the president, and there is a phase or a state of depoliticization in Egyptian society that does not want to engage within politics and believes that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has managed to stop some sort of a rupture that was happening within society in the period from 2011 to 2013. So it is not a mechanical political procedure. It is a very specific post-revolutionary context that is very unique in Egypt's case.
Right, but 97% of the vote, Dr. Akil, still on you. What made it so easy for him to win this election?
Well, first of all, there was, of course, the idea that there were no real competitors, not necessarily because of anything else other than the fact that Egyptian opposition has been in the remaking. Egyptian political forces have been in the remaking over the past 4 or 5 years. So there were some old nominees, old candidates that always ran into elections but are no longer credible and are no longer available for and can manage to muster public support. And at the same time, those political forces could not yet breed new leaderships. And at the same time, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's win, yes, it was a 97% win, but it is a completely different second term. There is absolutely different issues that need to be handled. There are different priorities, and there are supposedly different strategies that are supposed to be implemented in this coming phase. So while, yes, it is a very close percentage to the first term's election, but actually what's expected from this term is completely different.
Right. Michael, coming to you and listening to what Dr. Akil in Cairo has been telling us, what is your assessment of the state of Egypt's electoral democracy?
Well, I mean, clearly Egypt has been wrestling with kind of some conflicting, difficult circumstances. I mean, first and foremost, Egypt, and I think President Sisi recognizes that it has to be secure from Islamic terrorist threats and other regional security threats for any democratization to really be meaningful. It would obviously be a misrepresentation to say that Egypt has developed into some flourishing Jeffersonian democracy. It was a very flawed election. I do believe that the United States' relationship with Egypt is improving substantially on President Trump's watch. And clearly, you know, we continue to view Egypt as one of the strategically most vital countries in the world. It is the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid with $1.3 billion, an immense sum, really. And our both the economic and military partnerships, I think, are growing. And, you know, I think really as Egypt looks at its next logical progression, it would be to kind of how do you accommodate this very diverse, versatile country where Muslims, Christians, you know, exist, and where there are very conflicting views about the future of the country. That's an immense challenge for President Sisi. Nonetheless, I think he's aware of it. He clearly acknowledged it openly and right up front in his second inaugural speech in very impressive ways. So I think we have a strong relationship. I think the United States is well positioned to be a good source of counsel to the president, and we're hopeful that we're going to have in Egypt a good strategic partner, as they have been since President Sisi's arrival and since President Trump's inauguration, in the war on terrorism, which remains such an immense priority as far as I think everyone's global security in the region is concerned.
Indeed, and we shall touch on that in just a short while. But coming to you, Mustafa, and listening to Michael talk about the various challenges President Sisi has had to deal with when he first got elected in 2014. What was his mandate then, and how much has he achieved?
Yeah, when Abdel Fattah came into power in 2014, he was taking up the leadership in Egypt from Morsi, who had taken over leadership after the revolution way back in 2011. And if you look carefully at the issues that Egypt was facing then, the administration of the Muslim Brotherhood clearly did not really understand how things had changed and what was it that the Egyptians wanted. And this is why actually there were more people who came onto the streets, including Christians, Muslims, elites, the grassroots, to force the ouster of Morsi, who was democratically elected. The very people who went to the streets and actually asked Mubarak to leave, but they were more in number to ask Morsi to leave. Now, Sisi had to focus a lot more on security. At that time, there was this nascent growth of a terrorist insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula. And basically, Sisi had to deal with that, first of all, when he was the defense minister under Morsi's government and when he became the president. And security relationships with the neighboring countries became much, much more of a challenge because of ISIS emergence and really moving around to Libya, in the Sinai Peninsula, and all these issues made security very difficult around that time. Sisi had to deal with the second issue of economics, the declining economic situation in Egypt, which made the population become poorer and therefore less jobs. The earnings went down, and this in many ways challenged Sisi's leadership. And if you look at now what Sisi is doing, having security is the centerpiece of his strategy and also addressing economic issues.
All right, so coming to you, Dr. Akil, Mustafa here, of course, outlining security and economy as key priorities. Then we understand there's an impending cabinet reshuffle. What do we see? What do we hope to see in this reshuffle, if indeed it happens? What will it reflect?
Well, I think that, first of all, that the cabinet reshuffle is going to be much more of a mechanical reshuffle, not necessarily politically inspired. It is something that is more of a protocol. There has been a reshuffle recently, and a number of new ministers have come into office. Their main purpose, again, is the economic reform plan. There has been a lot of neoliberal elements that came into the Egyptian government. This shuffle is not going to witness the changes of any significant ministers, perhaps just mechanical substitutions. But the main priority of the Egyptian government over the coming perhaps 2 or 3 years is going to be monitoring the IMF plan, trying to cut down on subsidies, trying to increase on taxes, and at the same time trying to offer as much as welfare programs to the underprivileged or the lower classes as possible. There is absolutely no significant changes that are going to happen to this strategy at the coming period of time at all.
All right, and so Mustafa, as he starts his second term, what do you see as the expectations of Egyptians?
Well, the first thing that Egyptians are really looking at here is to have policies that is going to make sure that the economy grows fast enough to be able to absorb many young people that are coming into the job market. And one of the things that really always cause a problem in any country is when you have food prices, especially in a place like Egypt that imports up to 70% of its food go up, and with the subsidies being removed continually because IMF and other bodies are asking them to do, the earnings of an average Egyptian have to go up, and only sound economic policies and decisions are going to make that happen. But Egypt has to also engage with the extra regional powers. They've had very good relations with the United States of America under Sisi. That relation suffered during Morsi's time. Now you see Egypt engaging with other extra regional powers. Russia and China for the sake of its population.
All right, some interesting dynamics there. We shall talk about this in a bit more length in a short while. For now, we'll take a short break. And when we come back, we'll have more on Egypt and Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's second term in office. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. My expert panel of guests is still standing by. In Cairo, Dr. Ziad Akil, a political analyst and researcher with the Ahram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. In Philadelphia is Michael Jones, a policy analyst, and here with me in studio is Dr. Mustafa Ali, a security and conflict resolution expert. So, Dr. Akil, let's begin with you. Early last month, President Sisi vowed to strengthen relations with the United States and stressed the importance of the decades-long relations between the two countries. So the question is, what is America's interest in Egypt? And is Egypt a strategic partner the U.S. wants to use as a buffer against terrorism?
Well, of course, this has been one of the pillars of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's foreign policy, to actually give more strategic value to Egypt's regional and international roles through the idea of countering violent extremism and combating terrorism. And this is becoming one of Egypt's new roles within the international community, specifically in the Arab world, because there are so many zones of conflict present. Those zones of conflict are witnessing a vital role Egypt is playing, either in Libya or in Yemen or in Syria. So there are different phenomena related to terrorism that Egypt has started to use its role in those files to actually put more value to its partnerships internationally. Of course, Egypt remains to be a strategic partner for the U.S., and apparently this is not going to change, although a lot of leadership changes have been witnessed both in Egypt and the United States, but the strategic importance of these relationships are not going to change with the changing administrations. However, there is definitely a much more cooperative and efficient dynamic that's taking place between President Sisi and President Trump in recent months, because actually of the file of countering terrorism in the region.
Michael, let me come to you, because earlier on you mentioned that relations between Egypt and the U.S. have improved under President Trump. How much has the U.S. given to Egypt in the last 5 years in terms of arms and funding? I know you mentioned about $1.3 billion, but talk to us a little bit more about that.
Well, so $1.3 billion in total aid to Egypt. That makes Egypt the second largest recipient of our aid programs. It's clearly a recognition, as it has been for many decades, this is not new, of Egypt's importance to the United States and to the region and to the world, strategically, economically, as a force for anti-terrorism. We're engaged with a good degree of joint military exercises with Egypt, which I think are very important given what Iran has been doing to disrupt the region, with extensive support for terrorism in multiple countries. And impressively, you have President Sisi, during his visit to the United States and to the White House, a clear recognition that Iran represents one of the great threats to regional peace and security throughout that region. He was very forthcoming and upfront in acknowledging that, has supported our Iran policy, which I think is very valued. And we have now, I think, an opportunity with immense reform ongoing economically in Egypt for really what's going to, I think, be probably the biggest transformation in American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, where we're moving toward more partnerships with countries, away from, blind aid and into more strategic relationships. In the ideal world, I don't see any immediate opportunity for this necessarily. It would be wonderful to see a free trade agreement between the United States and Egypt, a bilateral agreement to augment the extensive strategic and other relationships that we have with President Sisi and the people of Egypt. So largely, I think you're going to continue to see that Egypt remains one of the most important countries in the world to President Trump, and our relationship with the leadership of Egypt continues to strengthen.
All right, so Mustafa Samavagid, is the U.S. defeating its own purpose by bombing Syria, by bombing Libya, by taking its embassy to Jerusalem, something which of course has received wide condemnation in the Middle East, including by Egypt, and yet is supporting Egypt's fight against terrorism? And what's your understanding of this scenario?
Yeah, many around the world were angered by the U.S. Decision to shift the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And, that's in clear violation, well, not the action itself, but when you look at the way the United Nations has actually passed resolutions on Jerusalem as an international city, tens of Security Council resolutions and the General Assembly resolutions that really see Jerusalem as one of those issues that will be settled last, and as a shared city between the Palestinians on the one hand and Israelis on the other hand. Now, the gesture that Trump, did towards Israel and shifting the embassy to Jerusalem in many ways complicates some of the predominantly Muslim countries' way of dealing with their own population. And Egypt is one of those. Many Egyptians, in fact, I would say overwhelmingly, almost all Egyptians do not really believe in the kind of actions and decisions that the Trump administration have taken. It makes groups otherwise that would be terrorists become much more or look or appear to be better than the governments that they themselves are supporting. So decisions that are unhelpful in many ways in strengthening relations between the United States of America and Muslim countries that are fighting terrorism. And perhaps those are some of the areas. Egypt is an important country geostrategically for the Middle East and for Africa. Sisi can play a big role in trying to engage some of these powers to really address the problems that we see in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, and between the Israelis and Palestinians. And by the way, Egypt has been one of the most credible interlocutors and mediators when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about Egypt's relationship with China, and this for you, Dr. Akel, because we do know that President Sisi, since he came to power, his relationship with China has really developed. 5 Egyptian-Chinese summits have been held in the last 3 years, which means that about 1/3 of all summit meetings between the two countries, in history were held by Sisi's presidency in only 3 years. So in light of this, the question then becomes, are Egypt's alliances now shifting from US-Egypt to China?
Well, I mean, if we're going to give the man his dues, Sisi has been very successful in foreign policy files. There is a complete difference between the relationship that Egypt has with the U.S. and the relationship Egypt is trying to develop with China. There is a strategic and a military significance to the relationship between Egypt and the U.S. It has to do with fighting terrorism. It has to do with the security of Israel. It has to do with the security of the Suez Canal. There is historic and strategic institutional dimensions in Egypt-U.S. relations. However, what President Sisi is trying to do is to actually have more and more of an economic relationship with China at the moment, whether this has to do with Chinese investments in Egypt or even with cultural relations. There is a lot of importance being put behind the idea of developing further foreign policy relations with other powers than the U.S., mainly Russia and China. But that does not mean that Egypt is planning to supplant its relationship with the U.S. or substitute it with Russia and China, because there is a strategic role that can hardly be substituted.
All right. And of course, we can talk about achieving all of these things, Michael, that Egypt wants to achieve without addressing the issue of security. So would you say security has improved under the Sisi administration?
Well, I mean, Sisi's clearly sought out strong relationships with a number of powers of the world. He's committed to growing that economy. I think he's going to move in the direction of democratization and human rights. That's not a guarantee, however. The challenge of Egypt is that it is an immensely complicated country, I think, with particularly the Muslim Brotherhood continuing to be engaged in some really ominous, troubling levels of activity in Egypt. And President Sisi's challenge is how do you balance the strategic needs of the country with the obvious need for continued political liberalization. So you've had, I think, in Egypt, a great, rich history of U.S. involvement. And our involvement in Egypt has been undeniably constructive. I mean, we have, I think, been able to juggle multiple priorities in impressive ways, both supporting the security of the region, engaged in anti-terrorist activity, and trying to stabilize that, and also improving economic and human rights conditions of the region. And clearly, by every measure, I mean, I mentioned 3 reports earlier that have come out from Harvard, the Heritage Foundation, and the IMF. Everyone seems to acknowledge, I think, that's looking at Egypt right now, that this is a country moving in the right direction. They're no longer manipulating the Egyptian pound.
Right.
They're not subsidizing sectors to the extent they were before. Those are all really constructive steps and should be suggestive that this economy is going to grow very rapidly if it continues to move in that direction.
All right. Thank you very much for those insights. And that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for your valuable insights. Dr. Ziad Akel in Cairo. He is a political analyst and researcher with the Ahram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. Michael Jones in Philadelphia. He is a policy analyst, president and executive director of the National Tea Party Community. And of course, with me here in studio, Dr. Mustafa Ali, a security and conflict resolution expert. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, and you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and also tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Kenina Karibe, it's goodbye.